Hello guys, and welcome to another J for JavaScript tutorial. It's been a busy week, but gratefully managed to get some time and record this part 1 where we're going to build this beautiful Tic Tac Toe using HTML and CSS. In part 2, we'll go ahead and connect our JavaScript to this beautiful build. As you can see, pretty much the games we've been playing since childhood. If you win, it'll show that you have won horizontally or vertically, and as you can see, or 1, and if X gets around, well, X wins. If it ends in a draw, you'll see right here it's a draw. We can restart as well, as you can see right there, and that's pretty much what we are going to build today. As always, I'll leave a link to the GitHub and the CodePen link for you to go and play around with this. So without further ado, this is where we're going to start from. This is our simple document already loaded HTML, and we are going to be using VS Code as always. So without wasting time, let's get started. And oh, by the way, before we officially start, this is a shout out to Sandy Duran, who actually recommended or requested this build. So yeah, I hope you enjoy this build and get to play around with it. And since the HTML and CSS are pretty simple, we're not going to do the copy and paste that we've been doing in the previous videos. This time we're going to code along and try to explain as much as I can why we do that. So let's start with the simple HTML layout. So let's start with the HTML boilerplate. And to do this, we're going to use the inbuilt extension in VS Code called Emmet. So if you don't know Emmet, Emmet is simply a code completion extension that helps us write faster, right? Complete our code faster, HTML code faster. So how I'm going to do it is I'm just going to press Shift, and on the top left below F1, there's my number 1. So Shift 1 will create that exclamation mark, and then you'll see it being highlighted. Press Enter, and then we have our simple HTML boilerplate. While we're here, let's change our title. Refresh, and as you can see, our title has reflected the text we have put in. All right, now let's go to our actual complete build and try to see what we're going to do. So we see there's an overall container holding our HTML element, and then there's that play, which probably will be our H1. Then there's a button of restart, and then our board where our zeros and x's will go. So if you notice below the play, there is an H2, I would say, as you can see, 0 wins diagonally, that will also insert using JavaScript. For now, we're going to build this. In this part, we're going to do the first part of HTML and CSS, and then in the second part, we will tackle the JavaScript. So saying this, we get to know, okay, we have a container. Inside the container, we have 2 to 3 elements, the H1, H2, and our button, and then a div that holds more of these containers per se. All right, let's go back to HTML. So once again, I'm going to mention this. We are going to use Emmet for our code completion purposes. So Emmet helps us complete code faster. So it's an inbuilt extension in VS Code, as I mentioned earlier. So if you're not well versed with it, don't worry. Just watch, try doing what I do, and I'll leave a guideline in the description below for you to get started. So let's start with our container. So previously we could just do this, open our divs, close them, but that's pretty much tedious and it takes time when you have a lot of elements to complete. So with Emmet, we simply just type in the element we want, and then if you want a class along with the element, we just add the dot, and then the name of the element, and then press enter. As you can see, we have our container, which is going to wrap all these elements in our complete build. Next, we have our h1. Again, we're going to use Emmet, and a smarter way to add text within your element using Emmet is simply opening up your curly bracket and then putting in the text you want Emmet to insert into your element and press enter, and you get that done for you as well. We previously alluded to the smaller text that appears below the h1, which we're going to definitely call an h2. So let's add that. As I said, we'll use JavaScript to insert that. Let's give it an ideal strategy. Moving on from that, we have a button, and the Emmet shortcut for that is btn. Awesome. As you can see, with Emmet, you're really writing faster and completing your code way faster than you would if you are typing this manually. After that, we have our board here, which is made of 9 boxes or squares. So we can simply create another div with an ID of our board. And before I continue, I always forget to wrap these elements inside our parent container. So make sure you do that. Okay, so back to our board div. Inside our board div, that's where we're going to include our children divs that will hold the squares. So there are multiple ways to accomplish this. You can use CSS Grid, JavaScript, or simply Flexbox. And in this round, we're going to use Flexbox to help us achieve these squares. So we can simply create mini divs with the ID of square, multiply the numbers of divs you want Emmet to create for you, and that's 9 in total. Press enter, and you have that done for you, as simple as that. And another cool subtle way of adding in code in multiple elements is just simply hold the Alt and then click on the element you want to add similar text to. And that's pretty much it. If we check our actual build, there's nothing. You see nothing because there's literally nothing we've put in our divs yet. So next, let's look at how we're going to style this up using CSS to look more like this. Okay, now let us design this document HTML file to look more like our complete build here. So how we do that, we're going to simply connect our HTML to our CSS file using a link syntax. So using Emmet, just type in link, press enter, then the name of your style sheet. You have to make sure that's the same spelling as you named your style sheet, otherwise it will not work. So let's test it and see if it's actually hooked. If this page turns all black, then we are good to go. As you can see, our CSS has been linked to our HTML and we're good to go. Great. So let's get styling. Okay, now to our styling. So today we're going to do something unusual, and that is we're going to use CSS variables. Well, Well, that simply allows us to store assigned values to our variables just like any other variable in a programming language. If that's confusing, I'll leave links in the description below for you to read more about CSS variables. But the reason why we use CSS variables when we are designing most of the times is not to repeat ourselves. You're going to find most of the times that the colors and the font family and any style really is shared amongst your children elements or most of your elements in your document, and you'll find yourself that you're repeating the same color over and over again. And to avoid that, or to write cleaner code, is simply using CSS variables. Instead of creating a new instance of that same color or the same style, you simply call the assigned value already to the CSS variable, making your code look more readable and just more easier to maintain, that so that when you change a variable's as variable's value, it changes all the styles or all the elements that have that style, which is pretty helpful. So that's what we're going to use. And if you haven't used CSS variables before, well, they're not that hard, really. It's simple as just using the root, calling the root element, then assigning your variables. So let's get started. So getting started with CSS variables is really simple, but if this is your first time, it might seem a little bit intimidating, but after a few tries, you get the hang of it. So the first thing we want to do when we are using CSS variables is calling the root. And how we do that is simply start with the colon and then the root. Open the curly braces. Now, inside the curly braces is where we place our variables. So how we define variables in CSS is a little bit different from how we do it in programming languages, but it's the same concept. So how we do it in CSS is simply prefix our variables, the two dashes, and then the name of the variable. Now, you want to make sure your name of the variable is making sense, just like in same principles of programming, so that you don't confuse yourself as well as your teammates. So in this case, we want to simply change our h1 text from black to red, and perfect variable name would be just text. And then the value you want to assign to your variable. In this case, it's a color. And how we use it is intuitive. All you have to do is call your element you want to assign a property to. In this case, is our h1, and then declare the property, CSS property. Now, initially, we would have to do this, and that would still work. As you can see, perfect. But then you already have a variable, so you don't need to repeat the color property. All you have to do is call the variable you've already defined above. And this is how we do it. We use the var keyword, and then within the braces, that's where we call our variable or invoke. And before you know it, we have the same result just like before. So this is how we use CSS variables. The takeaway here is if you notice that you have very many elements that share the same CSS properties, you're advised to use variables to make it easier to maintain and more readable. So this is out of the way. Let's get to design our tic-tac-toe game. So with that out of the way, let's first define the variables we are going to reuse in our CSS style sheet. We have already text, so we just need to give it the right color. And in this case, we're just going to simply give it a color of black. I highly recommend you get used to using hex codes, because with hex codes you are flexible. You get a more wide palette of creating really unique colors compared to just simply saying black, red, and blue, and green, and so on and so forth. So I recommend you get used to using hex code or the RGB a style. So in this case, we have our black. And now we want our background to be as in our build, you can see it's this kind of yellowish color. So and how you can get colors simply, I have a very helpful tool here I use to get quick hex code colors on websites. All I have to do is come and say pick color, and then I get the color, and simple as that. So you don't have to really know these, you just have to have useful tools to help you out. So it's just an eyedropper color picker, so you can get that and integrate it in your web browser. And what else do we have? We also want to give our button a variable. Again, back to our super helpful color picker. Great. And by the way, if you're wondering what extension I'm using for color highlight, it's simply called, well, as the name says, color highlight, right here by Sergey Namov. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So you can also install that in your VS Code to highlight your hex codes or any kind of color grades. And finally, our secondary text. Simply white. Great. So just to go through our variables, this will be our text. As you can see, our secondary text will be the white color here, and our background will be the yellow color you see here. So now, next, let's first get rid of this. Is now giving our document universal properties using the universal selector. As usual, margin 0. As you can see, everything is pushed to the top left of your web page. Box sizing, border box. Next, let's target our body. And give it a color, background color of our yellow. That is the font family we're using, as you can see. But then our background is not picking up the color, and the reason is simple. I had stringified my properties, my color properties. So make sure you don't put your hex codes in quotes, otherwise they won't be valued. So take a note of that. Okay, so we have our background and our text as well, and our font as well. To look at our H1, target our H1, give it a font size Let's look at our build. Inspect. Font size is about 80 pixels. As you can see, again, if you find yourself a font size is something you're going to repeat, you can turn it into a variable. Let's give it a margin bottom 0. Text decoration, uppercase. All this does is transform your text to all uppercase, whether it's written in lowercase or uppercase, or rather text transform. Great. Look at the build. It's coming into shape. And next, let's target our container. As you can see in our HTML, there's a div that's wrapped around the container that holds our h1 and all these kind of elements. Back to our build. See that our container has a height of 100 VH, a width of 100 view port width, and the display flex, just align content center, align items, and so on and so forth. So really inspecting web pages does help you to see the properties firsthand and know what kind of, did they use flex, did they use grid, and that kind of stuff. So here you can see we use flex. So let's do the same thing. As you can see, our properties are right here. Flex, look at our build. As you can see, it's now in a flex. If you want to see that, you can inspect this as well, and inspect. As you can see, they're now been put in a flex kind of way, which you can definitely see here and here. Great. Align items. And of course, direction column. Great. We have our elements in the center aligned and our buttons all in the center. Great. So now let us target the board, which is around here. Okay, so our board. So if you notice in our HTML, we attached or we assigned an ID to our board, our div or our div code wrapping around our board element, and we assigned an ID instead of class as you're used to here. So how do you target an ID in CSS? Well, we simply do that using the CSS ID selectors, and that's simply hashtags, right? So you just do a hashtag and the name of the ID you assigned to your element in the HTML, and you pretty much have your element targeted. So if you see the hashtag with the name, just know that's an ID selector, and yeah, and this is the class selector. The dot is a class selector, the hashtag is an ID selector, and the asterisk is the universal selector. So those are some of the differences you have to note if you are not familiar with CSS selectors. So with that out of the way, let's look at our board in the final build. So as you can see, our board is right here. It has these kind of boxes, and if we go down in our HTML, we'll find it right here, and you can see it right here. It has specific elements. As I said, you can play around with these numbers, and yes, until we find a desired number or desired element or property in that sense. And this is also great helpful for us when we are debugging some issues. So yes, anyway, let's now get to designing our board. That helps it fold into the next space. And a margin top of 40 pixels. Now, if we go back to our build, you're not going to see anything, right? But again, if you inspect, you'll find that there's some small highlight, and that's our div right here. So all it needs is content, right? But all that will make sense when we're implementing the JavaScript, which will be the second part. Right now, we're implementing the CSS, giving them the space where the boxes will fit in and where the content will fit in. So that being said, let's target the box class, which you can see here, or rather square, the class of square will be given the specific properties JavaScript will fit in our text or values. So let's target the square. Again, if we go back to our build and inspect, inside the board there's a box, as you can see here, and each box, in our case square, has these properties. So let's assign them that in our CSS. And just in case you want to see what that means, if you increase this, you increase the height of each box or square. By the way, there are simple shortcuts to that, which Emmet provides. You can say JCC, pretty intuitive. I'll probably make a short CSS video showing you how you can use shortcuts to write your CSS code faster. Same for align items, you can just do AIC and boom. Color, call our variable. And again, you're not going to see this in our build right now because this is where we use JavaScript to show our squares when content is being laid on. But as you inspect, you can see our square and boards have been laid out perfectly, as you can see right here. And we've come to an end of our CSS pretty much. The last thing we're going to look at is the restart button, which again we use the ID. As I said before, how we target IDs in CSS is simply using the CSS ID selector. And if you've noticed, our button here is missing that ID specifically. So we should add it there. Okay, now back to our CSS. We are going to add our final CSS property, and that's the restart. Style it and give it all the colors, just like in the build you're seeing here. So let us start with our restart button. Head to the build. As you can see, our restart button has the paddings on the background color and all these kind of properties. So let's get styling. Go back to our original build. Paddings already applied. Our button BG. Great. Then we have border none. Border radius of 20 pixels. Great. Again, if pixels and font sizes are something you're going to repeat, I advise you turn them into variables. As you can see, the shortcuts really help me write fast. Finally, text transform, TT, and there you have it. Look at our batch, exactly the same as we have in our final build. And awesome. I hope you enjoyed a CSS build. It's the first time we're building CSS together. I normally copy and explain this to you and we focus more on the JavaScript. But since the CSS was really just 62 lines of code, I thought why not? So hope you enjoyed. And lastly, let's push this to our GitHub. Ctrl J to pull out the terminal. Publish the branch. And if you check our remote repository, you'll find the branch ready to merge. You can check back to our master. And pull in the new changes. Great. And that's it. So done with our build. Next time we'll be looking at how we implement this using JavaScript and finish off our Tic Tac Toe game. Hope you enjoy the build. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.